I invite you to open up in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 31. That's where we're going to be at in just a little bit from now. Genesis chapter 31. I'm going to take a brief second to express my appreciation for your presence. As Shell mentioned, we do have several visitors in the audience, although they're not really visitors to me. I grew up with them, so they're not visitors to me, they're visitors to you. I would strongly encourage you to get to know about half of them. Their husbands, not so much. We get to know the wives. I think they're great people. Their husbands are too. I couldn't help but take a shot at some of them. But as we mentioned, we have lots of visitors here. This is kind of an emotional day. It's a big day. It's good to have lots of family in town, a lot of people in town. So it's good to be with each and every one of you. I appreciate the songs that Brad led. I thought they were very appropriate for the day. I thought the things that he had, or the songs that he led were very good, very solemn, very appropriate. So I appreciate his effort in that regard. As you may have noticed, if you've been here recently, if you've been here over the last 10 years, you may have noticed that Hillside has grown quite a bit. Hillside has, to my knowledge, grown almost 3 or 4 times fold. And that has nothing to do with me and my handsomeness, has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with this congregation. The growth that is happening is because the members are reaching out, evangelizing. And so I think we have a lot of things to be thankful for as we've noticed the congregation has gotten quite a bit bigger. But there's one family that's moved in recently that to me has very selfishly meant more, and I don't mean this to defame anybody else, but has meant a lot more to me than probably some other ones, and that's my parents. My parents, as you know, have moved here within the last couple of years, and I will tell you right now, it's been fantastic to have them in town. They moved here, I think, in October of last year, so this is their 1-year anniversary with us. And it's special to me because for the last however many years, I've been away from them. I moved away from home when I was 18, went to school in Deep East Texas in Nacogdoches. And so for the last 15 or so years, our relationship has kind of been over the telephone. It's been via email, it's been over Skype. I think there was a time where we used AOL Instant Messenger for a period, which was kind of weird. But that's mostly how our relationship has been. And so to have them in Greenville or outside of Greenville, allow them to be around them all the time, to me is one of the greatest blessings of my life. And I love it. I love them for being down here. I love it for that. I was talking to my mom the other day about how much I appreciated them being here, and I got really emotional about it. It was kind of a weird moment. I was just really emotional about it. And my mom very gently patted me on the shoulder and she said, "Honey, that's very sweet, but we moved here for the grandkids." Now, after I wiped the tears away from my eyes and got another cup of coffee, I realized just how true that is, because I know that my parents are not the only grandparents here. As I'm looking out this morning, I see lots of grandparents, a lot of people that are sitting right next to their grandkids, and that's to be celebrated. That's a bond that's very strong. And so I don't for one second defame that. I had that same relationship with my grandparents. I remember walking into my grandma's house, and just the smell of Ho-Hos and Doritos and Pepsis and cartoons was just enough to fill you with all sorts of warm feelings. And so that relationship between grandparents and grandkids to me is very strong. But that relationship, in my opinion, builds up everyone. For instance, there is a lower, according to a Boston College study, there's a lower risk of depression, substantially so, for both grandparents and grandkids who form some kind of a relationship together or have a strong relationship. And this is as a side point, there's a 37% lower mortality rate and lower risk of Alzheimer's for grandparents who regularly babysit their grandkids. That is a gift to all the young couples out there, to use that at your discretion later. But having this relationship between grandparents and grandkids has been known to have a whole lot of really, really important physiological benefits for you. But here's the kicker to all of this. This relationship and these benefits, and we'll talk about more here in a second, but the benefits of this only happen if there's a relationship in the first place. For some reason, all of these studies that have shown these lower risks of other things or really bad things have shown that for some reason there's a certain amount of grandparents that whenever they become grandparents have a tendency to withdraw. They don't like to be around it's not that they don't like their grandkids, it's not that they don't like their kids, they just tend to become more reserved. And studies have shown that a lot of that is because they don't want to interfere with what the parents are doing. They view this as kind of their retirement period. But what I would encourage all of us to do this morning, if you are a grandparent, is to get engaged with your grandkids. Now, I know some of you may be sitting here saying, well, I live a long way from my grandkids. I don't ever see them. We get to spend maybe Thanksgiving and Christmas together, so we don't get to see each other that much. I will tell you that there's an invention called Skype and FaceTime and cars that can help facilitate that relationship. But what I would encourage you to do is on some level, even if it's not physically, emotionally connect with your grandkids. Because that has benefits for all parties involved. There's a greater risk of, or there's greater influence when grandparents interact with their grandkids. For instance, 90% of people recorded that their influence were valued, or their values were influenced by their grandparents. And so if you're thinking to yourself, I don't have that much influence over my grandkids because I live far away or because their parents are around them all the time, I'm here to tell you right now, you can't influence them. As a matter of fact, those same studies, you notice there's a lot of themes this morning, but those same studies have shown that grandparents, for a large majority of people, form the second most influential role in that child's life. And so if you are not involved with your grandkids, or grandkids, if you're not involved with your grandparents, I would encourage you to strengthen that relationship. For whatever reason, people, as we mentioned, have a tendency to withdraw. They have a tendency to move back into themselves. But I would encourage you and remind you of a few things. Number one, you are your grandchild's rock. I want you to look at Genesis chapter 31. We mentioned that a second ago. Genesis chapter 31, right in the middle of this big behemoth book that covers a whole bunch of historical territory. And in Genesis chapter 31, we meet Jacob, who has a somewhat less than favorable relationship with his father-in-law Laban. Most of you are familiar with the story. Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. Laban gave him Leah instead. He had to work another 7 years in order to get Rachel. And you see this tension brewing in Genesis chapter 30 and 31. But at the end of Genesis chapter 31, this is where Jacob now takes off with Rachel, with Leah, with his two handmaids, takes off with his children. Look at verse 43. It says, Laban replied to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters or to their children whom they have borne? So now, verse 44, let us make a covenant. You and I, let it be a witness between you and me. What I want you to get from those two verses is that even though Laban comes off very unfavorably in most of his story, Laban has a strong familial love. He loves his kids. He loves his grandkids. He loves his family. Doesn't want to see them go away. Verse 45, Jacob then takes a stone, sets it up as a pillar, and Jacob says to his kinsmen, gather stones. So they take stones, they make a heap, they ate there by the heap. Now Laban called it Jagar Shahaduthah. Man, I really thought I was going to get that. Jacob, however, called it Gilead. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me this day. Therefore was named Gilead and Mizpah. For he said, may the Lord watch between you and me when we're absent one from another. Verse 50, if you mistreat my daughters, son, see if you haven't heard this conversation from your father-in-law over a period of time. Verse 50, if you mistreat my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Notice the ferocity with which Laban talks about this. Verse 51, Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, and behold the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass by this heap to you for harm, and you will not pass by this heap and this pillar to me for harm. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. This is a covenant that Laban is making with Jacob to protect his daughters and to protect his granddaughters. Verse 54, Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain, called his kinsmen to the meal, and they ate the meal, spent the night on the mountain. And early the next morning Laban arose and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. Laban departed and returned to his place. Depending on your translation there in Genesis chapter 31, what you'll notice is that Laban doesn't just kiss his own daughters, he kisses his grandchildren. And so even though Laban comes out very unfavorably through a lot of this story, where he's always kind of harassing Jacob, and he's always kind of punishing him for things that are very unfair, the one thing that you can see from all of this, and this isn't the explanation for all of this, but the one thing you can see is that Laban cares about his kids and cares about his grandkids. And I would argue to you that Jacob took this to heart. If you go 15 chapters in the future, if you look at Genesis chapter 48, actually 17 chapters in the future, but if you look at Genesis 48, you see much the same type of emotional attachment coming from Jacob. In Genesis chapter 48, starting in verse 1, it says, now it came about that after these things Joseph was told, behold, your father is sick. And he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. And when it was told to Jacob, behold, your son Joseph has come to you, that Israel, that's Jacob, collected his strength and sat up in the bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful, numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and I will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. That's the promise. But notice where his attention turns. In verse 5. Now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt. Before I came to you in Egypt, those are mine. Notice if that sounds familiar. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called the names of their brothers in the inheritance. Now as for me, when I come from Padan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey. When there was still some distance to go to Ephrathah, I buried her there on the way to Ephrathah, that is Bethlehem. And when Israel then saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, these are my sons, whom God has given to me here. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. Joseph brought them close to him. He kissed them and he embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your children as well. What you notice in this story is not just a strong familial attachment that Jacob has towards his kids, but there's lots of subtle things that you notice. For instance, the fact that right after this story, literally within a chapter of the story, Jacob dies. But with his dying strength, Jacob sits up in the bed, sits up on the couch, and looks at his two grandsons and blesses both of them. And thanks God for the fact that not only did he get to see Joseph, but he got to see his own grandkids as well. That's the love that Jacob carried over, not just from Laban, and that relationship was contentious to begin with, but that love that he has for his grandchildren that was taught to him, I believe, in part, at least by Laban. And you can see that the impact this had on Joseph when in verse 12, it says, Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. The respect that Joseph has for Jacob. You can tell what Jacob's dad meant to Joseph. You can tell what Jacob as a dad meant to Joseph, and you can tell what was important to Jacob by the fact that in the last few hours of his life, the last few verses, he makes it important to bless his grandkids. You can, grandparents, be that same rock to your family. You may think that for whatever reason, the parents are the ones that are 1,000% in charge, and you need to be way over here. But I'm here to tell you, you can have a great influence on your grandkids. All we have to do is try. There's a story there. Somebody asked an 8-year-old boy to describe a grandma. I thought this was kind of funny. An 8-year-old boy, describe your grandma. And this 8-year-old boy said, a grandmother is a lady who has no children of her own, so she likes other people's boys and girls. Grandmas don't have anything to do except be there. If they take us for walks, they slow down past pretty leaves and caterpillars. They never say, hurry up. They wear glasses. Sometimes they can even take their teeth out. They can answer questions like why dogs hate cats and why God isn't married. They don't talk like visitors do, which is hard to understand. And when they read to us, they don't skip words or mind if it's the same story again. Everyone should try to have a grandma, especially if you don't have television. Because grandmas are the only grown-ups who always have time. And isn't that kind of a theme when it comes to grandparents? That no matter how busy it seems like the parents' lives are, or the kids' lives even are, grandparents are, or should be, always there for you. They always will make time for you. They'll always make time to read you a story or to fill your stomach with ho-hos and sit you in front of cartoons on Saturday mornings. They'll always be there for you to lend an ear. And so for that reason, I would encourage you not only to remember that you're their rock, but to remember that you are their history. There's a special link that kids have with their grandparents, and it's deeper than the ones they have with their parents for one singular reason, and that's that they're older. Grandparents can tell their grandkids more about their family history. They can tell them more about events that happened in the past. They can tell them more about things that happened decades ago. And by establishing that foundation, that familial, intergenerational identity, those kids are going to be better off. They understand where they came from. They know who they are. They understand where their family came from. There's a deeper rooted identity inherent within that. After 9/11, there's a lot of studies that came out about this huge trauma that happened to so many families. And so psychologists went in and discussed to the kids, or talked to the kids, and they asked them how it meant to them, or what these events meant to them. And what they found out was that the kids who had a better understanding of their family's history came out better in the face of trauma than those who didn't. And I think you see this in Scripture. Look in Deuteronomy chapter 4, for instance. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Moses says, only give heed to yourself And the previous 8 verses talk about holding fast to the law. But in verse 9 he says, only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life. But make them known, here he says in verse 9, make them known to your sons and to your grandsons, and remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days of their lives they live on the earth, and that they may then teach their children. You came near, verse 11, and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire to the very heart of the heavens, darkness, cloud, thick gloom. And the Lord spoke to you from the midst of the fire, and you heard the sound of the words, but you saw no form, only a voice. And so, verse 13, he declared to you his covenant which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 commandments, and they wrote them on tablets of stone. The Lord commanded me at that time to teach your statutes and judgments, that you might perform them in the land where you are going over to possess it. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, this is a pivotal section in Deuteronomy, because what Moses wants them to understand and engrave into their mind is that image of God. He wants them to have that impression of God on top of the mountain with the smoke, with the fire, with the words, with the sounds. He wants that imagery in their mind. Because what Moses wants these people to do is tell it not only to their sons, but tell it to their grandsons. Now the logical question that comes out of that is why? Why does God care that some of his grandkids have a huge imagery, a very vivid image of God sitting on the mountain of Horeb? And I think, at least in parts, it's to feign off against idolatry. That when you see the Baal and you see the Asherah, these little idols made of wood, there's nothing within those that compares to the glory and the majesty of God. You are their history. So when you talk to your kids or your grandkids about what life used to be like, or when you tell them about your struggles that you went through, or you tell them about your own personal faith journey, I say that not in a denominational sense, but about your own struggles with your faith, it will mean something to them. And it will impact them in a way that very, very few people can. I read on the news not long ago, there's a little girl in North Carolina, I think she's 14 years old, and she has woken up every day for the last 2.5 years or so, believing that that day is June 17th, 2017. And that's because that was the day that that little girl, in a very unfortunate and very sad accident, was kicked in the head by somebody else. And she was kicked at just the right spot, or the wrong spot, however you want to look at it. Kicked at just the wrong spot, that every 2 hours, every 4 hours, her memory resets to that exact moment. And in the interview, she said, 2 hours from now, I won't even remember that we're having this conversation. I'll watch it on the news, I'll talk about it with my friends later, but I won't remember that this conversation ever took place. And my first thought was, how horribly tragic that you can't remember your past, that you can't remember your life, that you don't have any of these memories that fully develop. And then I realized just how tragic it was. Because when you think about your own life over the last 10, 15, 20 plus years, you realize that memories are the foundation of your life. The friendships you have right now are based off of things that you've done in the past. Your faith is based off studies you've had in the past, experiences you've had in the past. And if you don't have memories, then you don't have a foundation. And this little girl said something that I thought very interesting at the time. She said, it's useless for me to go to college, because by the end of school, I will have forgotten everything that I learned. Can you imagine a world without memories? Can you imagine a childhood without a foundation? Can you imagine a person that has no knowledge of who they even are? That's why in Deuteronomy chapter 4, God wants to make claim to these people that you need to tell your sons, you need to tell your grandkids exactly where you came from, because your identity is what makes you you. You see that in Exodus chapter 10, but I want you to look at Judges chapter 2. In Judges chapter 2, right after Joshua has swept through Canaan with that entire generation, they had victory after victory. In Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 6, it says that when Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his own inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And then Joshua, verse 8, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, 10 years younger than Moses was. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, and the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. All that generation were gathered to their fathers also, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. verse and understanding Judges and understanding what happens because you know the story. In the book of Judges, time and time again, the people depart from God. God sends them a judge to correct them. And that cycle goes over and over and over. But that begins, ladies and gentlemen, with Judges chapter 2 and verse 10. When they forget about the Lord, they forget about what He had done. They weren't there. They don't witness it. And because of that, they don't care. And then you look at the repercussions of that verse 11. The sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, who followed after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them. They bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord, verse 13. They served Baal. They served the Ashtaroth. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and He gave them in the hands of plunderers who plundered them, and He sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so they could no longer stand before their enemies. They have no national identity. They have no national recollection. They have no personal understanding of who they are. And because of that, they stop caring about God. It's the parents' responsibility to teach their kids, to train them up in the way, the teaching, the nurturing, the admonition of the Lord. But I would argue that responsibility can spill over to grandparents, who can form a very influential role in helping guide their grandkids and teaching them from a much more extended version of God and who He is and about the Bible. Don't forget either that you are their teacher. The easy thing to do here would just be to go to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. Talk about the influence that Lois and Eunice had on young Timothy. And I don't mean to bypass that at all. Because what Paul talks about in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5 is very simple. He says to Timothy, remember the gift, remember the teaching that came from your mother Lois and your grandmother Eunice. They have made you wise to understand scriptures that lead to salvation. Don't forsake that, Paul says. But there are many more examples in Scripture that we can turn to. I've thought about oftentimes the story of Ruth. Look at Ruth, the 4th chapter. I think the easiest way to talk about the story of Ruth is that it's one big emotional roller coaster from start to finish. And Naomi is somebody who has been through the ringer, has been through trials in her life, has had her faith tested. But the fortunate side of it is at the end of all of this, in Ruth chapter 4, Naomi has this kind of redemption story. She loses her husband, she loses her 2 sons, she loses one of her daughters-in-law, and Ruth is the only one that stands by her. And Ruth is the one that gives her offspring, that continues that family line. And so in Ruth, the 4th chapter, starting in verse 13, it says, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went into her. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the woman said to Naomi, Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may His name become famous in Israel. May He also be to you a restorer of life, a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. My mom says the exact same thing about Melina. Really? That's it? That was pretty good. I'm going to get brownie points for that, aren't I? Anyway, so Ruth, the 4th chapter, as we continue on. Ruth, the 4th chapter, verse 16. Notice how the story concludes. Ruth chapter 4, verse 16. Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and became his nurse. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, the funny thing about this is if you just look at this end of the story, you think, wow, what a fantastic redemptive story for Naomi. This is somebody who lost her sons, who lost her husband, who lost her daughter-in-law. And so the story of Ruth, the story of Naomi, ends up great. Because now she has this bouncing baby boy on her knee. And that's the only lesson we can derive from that. And then you forget, as it mentions there in verse 17, that she is essentially the great-grandmother of David. And when you look at the story of David, and you see just how steadfast he is, and you can't talk about David without at least in some part talking about Naomi. Because the very first few instances that we see of David, he's not fighting with his faith. He's not having immorality with Bathsheba. He's fighting against the lion. He's fighting against the bear. And because of that, he stands up to Goliath and boldly proclaims the God of heaven. And where did that understanding come from? Where did that knowledge of Jehovah, where did that understanding of God come from? You can argue it was from Jesse. You can argue that it was from Boaz. And both of those would be correct. But I would tell you, too, that at least in part, it comes from Naomi. You can see the same thing happening with Moses. Moses, who is given up by his mother to escape persecution. The daughter of Pharaoh takes him, and then she ends up getting Moses back, and then she raises him basically as her own. Now, obviously he is her own, but she raises him as his own. It's kind of a complicated story. But then the first time we see Moses standing up for a fellow Hebrew, killing an Egyptian to restore, to preserve his national identity. And then he comes back after 40 years, after his encounter with God in the burning bush, and he leads the people out of Egypt. Where did that understanding come from? I would argue to you in part, even though she's an unsung person, I would argue it in part came from Jochebed, which is Moses' mother, and who helped raise him for most of those first 20, 30, 40 years of his life. That understanding that Moses had, that understanding that David had, came from that intergenerational identity, but it was taught deliberately by people who loved them and who wanted them to grow up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22 says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." And I have no doubt that at least partially the way that Solomon meant that was financial. I think Solomon talks about an inheritance and estate, but I think he means more than that. I think he talks about a good name. I think he talks about a spiritual legacy. I think he talks about a spiritual understanding that Solomon had. I want you to look at Psalm 71 finally. Psalm 71. Psalm 71 starting in verse 17. Psalm 71 starting in verse 17. The psalmist writes in Psalm 71 and verse 17, "O God, you have taught me from my youth, and I still declare your wondrous deeds. And even when I am old and gray, O God, do not forsake me, until I declare your strength to this generation, your power to all who are to come. For your righteousness, O God, reaches to the heavens. You who have done great things, O God, who is like you. You have shown me many troubles and distresses, and will revive me again, and will bring me up again from the depths of the earth. May you increase my greatness and turn to comfort me." I like how the psalmist describes all the various things that God has done. The psalmist describes how God has lifted him up, how God has helped him, how God has strengthened him. But did you notice what the psalmist asks for? In Psalm 71 and verse 18, what he asks for is, "Don't let me pass away until I can declare your works to the next generation." That's the role of grandparents. The role of grandparents, honestly, is to spoil kids and give them back to their parents. At least that's the explanation I've been given. But at least part of the role of grandparents, and I would argue a major role, to help teach their grandchildren, help raise them, give them experience, give them teaching, be an influence on their life. A far greater capacity than sometimes we give them credit for. Because they can discuss the manifold works of God on a much longer scale than somebody that's younger can. And so if you're a grandparent here this morning and you haven't engaged with your grandkids, and I'm not talking to anybody besides Paul, but if you're sitting here this morning and you haven't engaged with your grandkids, I would encourage you to be an influence on them. Reach out to them, whether they live 1,000 miles away or whether they're sitting 2 feet from you. Be an influence, emotionally, spiritually on them. Because I think you'll be surprised just how much of an impact you can make on them and how much they'll think about it and thank you for it years and decades down the road. If you're not a Christian, we offer this opportunity for anybody to come and make that call and let you sure. Won't you?